Welcome to the Future Generations Podcast, providing you with the world-changing content necessary to inspire you, your family, and our planet to a life of optimal health potential. We'll help you make the choices that powerfully influence the lives you bring into this world. It's time to strengthen our resolve to do better now and for our future generations with your host, Dr. Stanton Hom.
Welcome to another solo cast. What's up, guys? It has been a while since I've been on here solo, and for all intents and purposes, I'm actually very surprised to be here right now. But this is one of the most important episodes that I believe that I will record, and this is going to be a series of recordings as we start the promotional period of the end of COVID. I don't know if you've seen that going around, but many of you have expressed to me that you were super stoked that I get to be a part of this. And I was very humbled to be asked to be one of the hosts. And I got to host 4 sessions. I'm going to talk through those just a little bit today. I got interviewed for 2 sessions. I'm going to give you some background about those as well. But this series of solo casts is going to maybe give you a little bit of a background of what I experienced as a part of it, what I believe is critically essential as we move forward and move through this program, because many of you agree, and many of you have seen for just as long as I have over the last 3 years, not only the manifestation of something that was truly orchestrated by the system, but we're starting to see the orchestration of the next thing. You're starting to see SPARs. It's like it's laughable, right? To think that, oh, they did a whole, prequel to COVID with a coronavirus outbreak, and now Johns Hopkins is coming out with documents and actual battle planning of and wargaming of a SPARS outbreak, and we're starting to see headlines of Jamie Foxx and normalizing injuries from shots, but at the same time, the actual verbiage in the headlines and in the articles is almost to the T what these documents from Johns Hopkins are actually coming up with. Why is this important? Is whether you look back all the way back to smallpox or the things that involved me, right? The anthrax threat for 9/11 and the Operation Iraqi Freedom, all the way to measles and Disneyland, all the way to virtually every quote outbreak that is based upon a quote viral pandemic to H1N1. Like, there is a calculated orchestration that if you don't pick up on, then you honestly will leave those seeds planted for the next thing that comes around. And what the end of COVID represents is one of the most comprehensive outlays of 90 sessions that go through, and I'm going to read the different modules and themes, right? Because this is really, really, really important. It's going to start on June 20th, and it begins with Act 1, the narrative, right? It goes through setting the stage, goes through the origin story, goes through the quote isolation of SARS-CoV-2, to the genome, to the variants, to the PCR tests, to what's actually under the microscopes, to FOIA requests, and virology itself on trial, to the narrative. Act 2 goes into the science and logic of virology, aka the potentially the paucity of science and logic, the control experiments, the proof of contagion, or the potential lack thereof, and all the way through, right? I'm not going to go through every single one, but the narrative. Act 3 talks about the epicenter in New York, talks about the captivity, talks about the super spreading of truth, talks about, the numbers kind of worldwide, especially the numbers that comes through from VAERS. Narrative. Act 4 comes through with like HCQ and ivermectin, And while many of you can sit back and be like, hey, I know this. What I will tell you, because I got to host some of these sessions, is when I sat with specifically episode 35, the DMED data, and Dr. Pete Chambers, Dr. Theresa Long, Dr. Sam Siegel, all military doctors. DMED essentially is the diagnostic system for the military, right? It's called the Defense Medical Epidemiological Database. And why this is important is it's real time. VAERS has always been criticized as a passive. It's retroactive. It's something that is based upon doctors remembering, aka if they do report an injury, if they do report an adverse reaction, aka I've been calling them intended consequence of the shots. But DMED data is specifically important because it is real time. And there was also some real-time challenges that these 3 military officers and doctors realized as they were highlighting and exposing the sometimes 1,100% increase of specific diagnoses, from testicular cancers to autoimmune conditions to neurological damage, that they started to expose some of the things that the DoD, the Department of Defense, was saying and not saying, and how they were fudging numbers and how they were reporting numbers or not reporting numbers. That act is called the spinoff, aka a spinoff COVID shots, like going through mRNA shots part 1 through 3, DMED data, the damage from frontline voices, what is shedding, all the way to the voices of victims. The voice of the victims is one of Alex Zeck's, in my opinion, most important moments over the last 3 years, where he started to highlight the stories from a lot of those injured from the COVID shot, and he started to air these episodes on the Health, Freedom, for Humanities podcast. And I thought not only were they gut wrenching, but they were exposing, sometimes on a major scale, the biggest platform, but also with a radically compassionate, but very, very, very logically understood mindset that Alec interviews with. And this session with part 1 is with Felicity Jackson, Britt Galvin, Pamela Goodman, and Cheryl Ruckers. Oh man, I just interviewed Cheryl on this podcast. You will see that interview, and it is such a rad. She's such a rad person. And what it does is it takes, not just because we do it on our side too, right? We do it where if something happens to somebody, we just repost it. And oftentimes we don't always see and feel and hear the humanness of the person. And what I know and what I expect from this episode is one of the most important aspects of all the things that come out of not just the end of COVID, but a lot of what we are bringing to this movement is this rehumanization of those who have been basically chastised, marginalized, demonized, especially for telling their own story, especially those who've been injured. I get to interview for the chapter, which is the prequel, Science and Corruption, episode 40, is Voices of the Victims, part 2, with Jody Meshik. And I've been saying for a long time, and I will talk about this in a future episode also, that most people don't recognize the movement for health freedom today has ridden on the backs of mothers of vaccine-injured children who have been in this movement, in state capitals, in legislators' offices, at NIH, at CDC, ACIP meetings, virtually across the board fighting for this this freedom of choice, this informed consent, fighting for their children. And Jody's story, if you haven't listened to her episode on our podcast, it was a powerful reminder of not only just the sheer amount of gaslighting that occurs in a pediatrician's office after kids have been injured by the exact recommended, aka mandated shots that these kids get, was on the tail end. Jody has not only helped heal her son through radical gut protocols, not radical, but actually just very normal, very healthy gut protocols, a very diverse approach from a natural healthcare perspective. Jody is one of my experts, somebody I look up to from an essential oil perspective. She is one of the industry standards, especially as it relates to vaccine injury. But she also talks about things like camel milk. She talks about, which I believe to be one of the most important aspects, is the book that she wrote about her son's healing, but the book that she is releasing that is for parents, that's for mothers, that's for those who are in the trench with their kids, fighting for their own informed consent, fighting for their own health freedom, how to radically enliven that deep sense of purpose that you have. And many of you who listen to this podcast are parents. I highly encourage you to pre-order her book, to follow her on social media, and if called to, join the Warrior Center, which is where she does a lot of her private membership work. Moving into 45, in the same section, which also talks about detoxification, it actually has a documentary by Roman Bystrianic. I don't know if you know who he is. You should. If you have not read Dissolving Illusions, many of you are newer to the movement for health freedom, don't really know the deep kind of background of the childhood vaccine movement. If you do, fantastic. But Dissolving Illusions is easily top 1 or 2 books that I've ever read. And that was written by Dr. Suzanne Humphreys, who I don't know where she is today. But I do know the last time that I heard her speak, she had a cadre of security because of the number of death threats that she was getting. But Roman Bystrianic is her co-author, and he actually created a documentary specifically for the end of COVID that I can't wait to watch. I'll be watching alongside you guys, but going through also Big Pharma's Dark Past. The Greater Good is going to be shown. I don't know if you've seen that documentary, but The Greater Good is one of the foundational videos highlighting the craziness that exists behind mandated childhood shots and the lack of safety and the injurious and deadly nature of them. But this takes me to session 45, which is a pediatrician's perspective with Dr. Larry Pilepsky. I got to do this episode, and I got to do this episode humbly, but it was one of the most important conversations that needs to be understood and talked about, from how our children have navigated this, how they have been basically put on the chopping block, how they have been targeted from the beginning to the end and continue to be, and how the history of shots from a pediatrician's perspective, his own radical transformation as a result of meeting a chiropractor, which I humbly received as affirmation for what I get to do, but also talking about just the radical misnomer of infectious illness at large, especially those that affect our kids. And so this goes through professional institutions and Rockefeller medicine, the fallacy of peer review, and conditioned credentialism. This is all radically important because it starts to kind of dive into the corruption of science in general, because corruption of the industry that is calculated, right? 1911 or 1910, the Flexner Report was essentially the birth of Rockefeller medicine, where they basically closed thousands and thousands of medical schools as a result of auditing their education. Essentially, if they weren't in alignment with the petroleum-based chemical industry that was about to birth and take over the pharmaceutical industry, ousting virtually every natural healthcare practice that there is, almost to the complete demise of homeopathy. Homeopathy was basically destroyed as a profession, not as an actual medicine. And osteopathy wasn't too much further behind. By 1922, I believe the osteopaths in California sold out completely to the California Medical Board. And I will not talk about chiropractic, but I did talk about chiropractic when we got to session 65, but I'm not there yet. The next phase is germ theory, reality or science fiction. It goes through this 49 through 59 alone. If you were to focus on one area, I would say this area. I'm not even a part of this. I'm not interviewed, and I don't interview in this area in particular, but it goes through Béchamp and Pasteur. These two guys were basically neck and neck for who was essentially going to get, you know, the cultural authority for essentially whether the germ theory or the terrain theory was going to become the prevailing belief system for healthcare in general, or for society in general. And this conversation, I can't wait for it. Jacob Diaz and Dr. Barry Lando. I can't wait to hear this conversation myself, because I know I've studied it ad nauseum. But when I hear from people who are deep-seated experts, it is a humbling experience to recognize that I know, but I don't know quite as much as the experts that are actually interviewed. But it goes through the history of biology, it goes through the role of bacteria, molds, fungi, parasites, talks about measles, chickenpox, and polio. What about Lyme disease? What about antibodies? This whole conversation about antibodies, where if you've listened to my interview with Tom Cowan, where he basically has charged the entire healthcare industry. I got to hear him on at a conference. I was tuned in virtually. It was with an amazing company called Cellcore, and they were brave, and they brought Tom in, and Tom did, I want to say 3 or 4 hours, and just dropped every deep-seated truth that I thought was going to be received in a way that was like, whoa, like, you are challenging all of our worldview. Where's your science behind this? I'm an expert as well. And what I heard was that it was so well received that people were rethinking their worldview with regard to how they believe that the body is even structured at all, but let alone how it actually heals. But this session goes through what really makes us ill, like what really makes us sick. And it goes through also kind of that deep understanding of what terrain is. If you don't understand the difference between germ theory and terrain theory, we'll get into that in future solo casts. But in the lead up, I want to share a lot of the bigger picture of what we're doing, and get further into the notes and into the weeds as we go. The next chapter essentially is who's directing the show. WHO is directing the show, where number 60 is the agenda, the Great Reset, digital IDs, transhumanism, the WHO pandemic treaty. And this gets to the last session in this one, which is number 64, which is convictions over complacency, where I get to be interviewed with the one and only Dr. Ben Tapper. And I love Ben for a lot of reasons. I love him for the man he is. I love him for the family man he is, especially the dad he is. I especially love him for the chiropractor he is, because I started to see his videos go viral early on Facebook. I wasn't on social media before, and I don't love being on social media now. And I didn't realize at the time when he was putting out those 2 and 3 minute speeches at the city council in Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, he was actually sitting at a table across from his own family, who are medical doctors, who are licensed professionals, who are outnumbering him 10 to 1. And he is speaking with a level of conviction, quoting founding fathers and mothers of this country, speaking truth to power in a way that many of us didn't know that we could and should. And it was so inspiring. When I met Ben at the Big Idea, Devin Verana's gig in gosh, where were we? I think it's also Nebraska. No, shoot, all those Midwest states. Kansas. Dang it. I can't remember where we were. But either way, the Big Idea, Devin Verana's event, I met Ben, and I've told this story, and I told this story during the interview, and he was one of the most humble, one of the most amazingly authentic, collegial, compassionate, powerful men that I had ever met. And one thing that I did was I volunteered to be a part, or he asked me, and I said yes, to be a part of his movie, The Time Is Now. And in the light of the weekend, he was very, very transparent with his experience, but especially with his experience to how this movement has affected him and his family. And he showed me his phone, on how his phone was hacked. And he showed me how essentially the death threats that he had received, the threats to his family, because these people apparently know when he travels, that he received. And I sat there and I felt a deep-seated call to pledge my devotion to the movement, and to do the very best I could to, if he's out there as a tip of the spear, taking many, many arrows for our profession, for our kids, for our way of life, for the truth, that I would step up bigger so that I could take some of those arrows for him. And I believe that to be one of the most important lessons that I believe we could all know and live into, because we don't quite recognize like somebody like Alex Zek, or somebody like David Icke, or somebody like Dr. Tom Cowan, Dr. Amanda Vollmer, Dr. Andy Kaufman, Dr. Larry Pilevsky, Jody Meshek for many, many years, to the three military doctors that I got to speak to. The threats on people's lives and livelihoods is far greater than I know most people know, and that most people appreciate. And I don't say that in a way to shame anybody. I say that in a way to help people recognize that this thing, right, this thing that Alec has created, the end of COVID, is actually coming in the wake of some of the most, which, because I know and love Alec as I call him my big little bro, in the wake of some of the biggest traumas that not just anyone could experience ever in life, but Alec personally experienced, with the dissolution of Health Freedom for Humanity, with challenges that he's had in his own family, to how a lot of what we have navigated have affected our children, to virtually all aspects, which I know that when I say this, you have all felt that effect on your own family as well. I know I have, and I've shared that. I've shared series after series of Luca's story, which I can't wait to share in SoloCast. One of the most miraculous things that I can't wait to share about Luca and his radical healing. But for Ben, I wanted to communicate to both Alec and him the devotion that I had and have and will always have for them, for really just being dads, for being husbands of authenticity, of compassion, of power and strength, of love, of courage and bravery, but also because I believe they are a version of the blueprint that must really be ironed in. Iron sharpens iron to our future humanity. And so convictions over complacency is recognizing that, as we have said on this podcast, and as we have said on many stages at this point, that silence is complicity, and it's not just screaming at the mountaintop, condemning people, bringing people down. Conviction is about speaking truth to power in with the intention to lift them up and inspire them to a greater version of themselves, because the greatest version of ourselves needs to show up in preparation, not only for this event, to prepare us for what is potentially to come in the future. The next one is rewriting the script and the way forward. I love it, man. The illusion of authority, law of mankind in action, which is Greg Paul's amazing group. Emancipating health healing professionals. This one, episode 70, the true history of Western education with David James Rodriguez. I'll share more about that in detail. But David, I met in Sacramento. I saw his influence in the state of California. He is still in California, but fighting for our children's rights in Sacramento, which I have done, for virtually my entire career, to some degree. But I met him. I think he had a megaphone, and he was speaking out about all the truths and all the falsehoods that exist out there, but also specifically surrounding kids and education. He is one of the people that I go to for homeschool authority, cultural authority in homeschool. But his interview in the true history of Western education, basically the intent behind it for hundreds of years at this point, that these puppeteers and these puppet strings pullers with regard to education, they know that in one generation they can educate out of our children their own sovereignty, their own agency, and they will then become sock puppets and cogs in the wheel of the machine that we all know as the Matrix. Episode 72, this one I'm super excited. Actually, 71 I'm excited about, the journey home with Derek Kramer. Derek Kramer is one of, I don't know exactly what Garrett is. I believe he is a philosopher, but I love what he has communicated over the last 3 years. And I love how he speaks to human consciousness in a way that's not only deeply convicted in our times, but very, very high vibration and high expression of human potential. But 72 right after is What is the Way Forward? That's Mike Winter and Alex Zek. I'm excited for that one because they're two of some of my favorite people that I've gotten to work with, collaborate with, communicate with, and be inspired by, about creating solutions, radical solutions that are actually just ancestral normal solutions that that we know are a part of as this program shifts and changes perfectly into the next segue of the next chapter, which is A New Health Story Part 1. This short film by James and Chris, I don't know the last names, but What If My Body is Brilliant? I saw a preview of it. And if you are a believer and a lover of how the body is this infinitely wise, self-healing, self-regenerating, self-regulating, self-adapting entity with an infinite brilliance and beauty and wisdom embedded into its infrastructure, then I encourage you to dive in on this short film, because it is narrated and it is one of the most beautiful depictions of what the brilliance of the body actually is. It goes into some of the really important things. This is where we shift gears in a very high energy, high vibrational way. Bioterrain medicine, a holography of our terrain, the human biofield, German new medicine, Dr. Melissa Sell, somebody that we are bringing to the podcast very soon, self-reclamation with Dr. Kelly Brogan. And then we shift into a new health story part 2, which goes from sessions 82 with the fourth phase of water, that gel structured water, to Veda Austin's work and the mystery of water, which if you remember back, I believe it was in like the early 2000s, where the Japanese scientist Emoto was coming out with just the depictions of affirmations, words of power, just labeled on to water bottles, and then looking at how those crystal structures would build, was remarkable, because you could see when something was of negative, demeaning, disempowering affirmations, or deaffirmations, you could see that it would affect the structure and the entity of the water, which if you just think water is H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom put together for a water molecule, you would think that it's just the way it is, H2O. But there is a context to it. And Veda Austin, if you don't follow her, and if you don't see how she is showing how water literally mimics the energetic field around it, and this isn't hocus pocus, it is repeatable for her, then you will be absolutely mind blown. 84 is the new cell biology with Dr. Tom Cowan. He just released the new biology curriculum, which I'm super excited about. Water fasting with Dr. Dr. Ely, somebody I have followed from the very, very beginning. Homeopathy, alchemical health, esoteric biochemistry. And then session 89 is one that I got to do with one of my heroes, Sally Fallon Morell, author of Nourishing Traditions, founder of the Weston Price Foundation. This episode and this interview with Alec was one of the more, I wish we had an entire series on this one subject, the only normal. And the only normal is probably the flagship of all the flagships that I would say that Future Generations has represented for over 14 years, since our inception. Why this is important is most people believe that there could be a new normal, that there was an old normal, when in reality, when you understand the work of Weston Price and the understanding of how the modernization of these biohackers, most of the things that they are promoting today, whether it's cold plunge, whether it's infrared saunas, whether it's bone broth, whether it's structured water, whether it is, you name the thing, organ meats, AKA, to some respects, plant-based perspectives. And I don't mean that pure vegan, you know what I mean? That what becomes and what has become trendy in modern healthcare, especially alternative healthcare, AKA normal healthcare and optimal healthcare, most of which Dr. Weston Price and Sally Fallon Morell, through Nourishing Traditions and through the book Physical and Nutritional Degeneration, written in the early 1900s, based on Weston Price's work of understanding ancestral tribes, whether it's hunter-gatherer tribes or fisher tribes, and the influx of industry, and how it was so calculated that the degeneration of the human, of human health, but the human body, specifically through the lens that Weston Price looked at, was dental caries. Dental health was dramatically changed when white sugar, white flour, and white foods were brought into ancestral tribes. Generation after generation, he actually saw that the narrowing of the palate and the cranial structure, the cranial vault, was dramatically different. In one generation, the next time babies were born, with the influx of these foods that were largely processed and from industry, toxic to a tribe that had been in the bush essentially for their entire history, that in one generation, chronic disease would be the prevailing way that people would not only afflict health issues, which they didn't really have those before, but further, they could see it echo into the future, into their offspring and their children. And we talked about that. We talked about how in my practice for over a decade, we had been solely, almost expert, laser focused in teaching young parents who are starting their families how to have informed consent and optimal, empowering birthing experience, how to build a birth team, how to understand that all of their choices matter, how to be seen, heard, and valued through the process of their spiritual, energetic preconception healing phase to conception, to pregnancy, to birth and delivery and postpartum. And we started to see this dichotomy, right? This split of the types of kids that were in our office, where those who came through our practice, and this is palpable even today, 14 years later, those who came through our office were expressing a level of health that was drastically different from those that came referred to our office. I would assert to you that if you don't know that about me and know that about future generations yet, then please dig deeper into our work, and please understand that if you are in San Diego, you have to be a part of our community to actually truly understand what it's going to take to not only end COVID, but to live in a way that none of that BS tyranny ever happens to your family again. And so we got to talk about from two different lenses. One is like this mother who was inspired by this new understanding of health and then created an entire cookbook, nourishing traditions, and a philosophical perspective and a worldview that all the recipes that you see in nourishing traditions are things that are trending today. Bone broth, she's teaching you how to make it years and decades ago. And it's one of the most sought after health foods in the world today. And so this woman is one of my favorite people, but to be able to stand alongside her and through two different lenses, teach about things that are so radically foundational, not only for the health and vibrancy of you, the health and vibrancy of your family, but that echoes into your future family tree, but to mentally, spiritually, and physically prepare you to end COVID and all of these pandemics once and for all. Ending the session is with Dr. Edith Mbutu Chan, who we've yet to have on the podcast. The 6 dimensions of health, HEALTH, and then it ends. And it's a powerful thing in a way that I don't think you could truly ever encapsulate. I'm humbled to be one of the hosts. I'm humbled to be one of the contributors from an interview perspective. And I'm honored to be a part of one of the most foundational solutions that I believe exists today in the world. And in the end, I hope you dig in. I was talking to Alec because he has been so inspired by this. I know Alec to be a man on the mission, but I have not seen him this pumped as I have seen for the end of COVID. And one of the things that he is enlisting is that you sign up, right? The link in our bio goes directly to how you can gather more information as we create the buzz before the June 20th start date. But what I said to Alec was something that I don't know if he knew we were going to say, or what was one way that I believe that this would echo into the future, is that I told him that what he has actually created is a postgraduate program for virtually all allied health providers who, if done right, this can actually be launched not just to the end user public, which I'm grateful it is, because none of this information should only be stuck for doctors and licensed professionals. That's what got us into this mess, right? This should be readily available for virtually every human on the planet. I would venture to say that this would be a radical homeschool education for teenage kids and higher, because I believe that they will be able to navigate it with their own minds and thoughts, especially if they are in homeschool programs, because they will invariably, like I believe David James Rodriguez said, he's graduating some kids at 14, 15 years old. And the intellectual competence of many of these children is far more vast, and the genius level is far more vast. And when they get exposed to something like this, they will captivate and take it to another level, sometimes far more effectively and efficiently than many of us, because we have decades and decades and decades of potentially limiting beliefs that many of us are stuck in. But I was speaking to Alex specifically around a postgraduate educational program for many of these allied health professionals, many of whom are at this point unlicensed and can't get a lot of this information in mass in one particular place, because I've done so many. I have so many letters behind my name that I don't really care about anymore, but it doesn't hold a candle to the deep desire for constant and never-ending education and improvement that I'm constantly looking for. And so I see this being a stamp and a flag in the sand right now that is going to echo through these ripples and waves and tsunamis into the populace that I don't believe is going to catch everybody. I think a ton of people are going to get drowned. But I think a ton of people are going to ride that wave and surf that massive wave with a level of inspiration and purpose for the next phase of this journey, which on one end we can see as clear as day. It's 100 years of orchestrated puppeteering, the cabal living out and manifesting what they know they have orchestrated, right? The level of tyranny, the level of enslavement, but all of that pales in comparison when it's compared to the truth. And when you look at what this event alone will do, is it will give you a vehicle to create in your own family tree, in your own world, in your own communities, in your own bloodline, that ripple effect, that wave effect, that tsunami wave effect of power, empowerment, inspiration, transformation that we all have essentially been calling for in one form or another. I'm excited to share this with you. I'm excited to bring this to our community, and I'm excited for you because I know that if you dig in here, that you will be a part of the changing of human consciousness in a way that is building a grit, that is building a resiliency, that is building an adaptability mentally, physically, but very much spiritually in this spiritual war that we are finding ourselves in. Thank you guys for listening. That link in our show notes, that link in our bio, I hope you click it. I hope you share with your friends and family, especially those who are still stuck in that old perspective. Why? Because you may be the only voice. We know we saw our families and so many of our friends and our community captive with what happened over the last over the last 3 years. But I encourage you with the biggest heart and love, whole picture of love, right? Not just the rainbows and puppy dogs, but the kick in the butt conviction with the intent to empower, uplift, and inspire. Share this with some of your family members that are deeply entrenched, and just keep planting the seed. Because in the end, what you know is you may be that soul voice that sees where they're at, that sees the trajectory of their life, think about their kids and their kids and their kids, and recognize that you don't have to have that relationship right now with your sibling, with your cousins, with your generation, but think about their future generations. Think about the family trees that are going to be populating a planet with your kids, because if you do that, I promise you, you will be more brave than you could have ever imagined. I deeply love and appreciate you all. I hope you dig in. Please share this episode, and please share the link for the end of COVID. Love you guys.
We appreciate you joining us for this episode of the Future Generations Podcast. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. For more resources based on today's episode, as well as more ways to inspire a brighter future for you and your family, visit us at thefuturegen.com. That's all available exclusively on thefuturegen.com.